Hi, everyone. First of all, welcome and thank you for coming to join us. My name is David Allen, and I work at the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration in the Arctic Research Program that is part of the Global Oceans Monitoring and Observing Program. And again, welcome and thanks, Liz. Next slide, please. So this report was actually prepared in response to House Report 11797 that accompanied the Consolidated Appropriations Act of 2022. In it, the House recognized the significant impacts of a changing climate in the Arctic and directed the Office of Science and Technology Policy, where our colleague Larry sits, that's on this call, to develop a report on the need to establish and maintain a sustained Arctic observing network, including recommendations on the implementation and construction of such a network. In accordance with the law, the report was developed over 180 days after the law was enacted. The report was submitted on December 15th of 2022 to the House Appropriations Subcommittee. As is shown on this slide, our goals in this webinar are to provide you with an overview with the report, engage you in an early discussion around the report, and discuss next steps in the process, and then consider how this work could benefit you and your community, organization, or agency. Next slide, please. So shown here is sort of the core team that led the development of the report, including the co-chairs, Roberto Delgado from the Arctic Observing Network Program at National Science Foundation, Thorsten Marcus from the Cryospheric Sciences Program at NASA, Sandy Starkweather, who is the Executive Director of the U.S. Arctic Observing Network from the NOAA Cooperative Institute for Research in Environmental Sciences at the University of Colorado Boulder. That is a mouthful. And then finally, but certainly not least, the managing editor of the report, Shoko Shinbrat, who is a AAAS Science and Technology Fellow at the National Science Foundation Office of Polar Programs. So before we embark on the depth of the presentation, we wanted to understand your interest in the Arctic and Arctic observing. So we're going to share a link in the chat to a short poll using an application called Mentimeter. And I'm going to turn to my colleague Liz, who is much more adept in actually guiding you through these processes, so we can respond to these questions and move forward. Liz, take it away. Thanks.
Thanks, David. Yeah, so Mentimeter is going to help us get your reactions to a few quick questions. So Hazel has put the link directly in the chat to the Mentimeter. Alternative ways you can access it, you can go to menti.com and enter the code 81347600. Once again, that's 81347600. Or if you've got a phone handy, you can scan the QR code that is on the screen. So we'll give everyone a moment to do that. And then Hazel, do you want to move to the next slide? All right, so our first question is, what's your region or area of interest regarding Arctic observing? And if you haven't gotten to the Mentimeter page yet, again, the link is in the chat. And also you can go to www.menti.com, that's MENTI.com, and use the code 81347600. That's at the top of the slide here. So if you're not good at hearing numbers and typing them in, like me, you have a way to see them directly. So we've got some community-based interests, some Siberian Arctic Ocean, satellites, methane, things are moving really fast, community-based monitoring, climate change, resource manager, atmosphere, aerosols, Northern Alaska, lots of varied interests here. Definitely seeing several people who have put in things along the lines of marine ecosystems. We've got the Bering Sea in here. We've got quite a few community-based monitoring, community support. We've got some stuff around surface fluxes, some stuff around atmosphere, really good variety of things here. All right, we're gonna move on to the next one, which is, what are you most interested in learning or discussing today? You can say it in one word or a couple of words. Recent updates, ways to collaborate, next steps after the report. We're going to cover all of those things, the way forward for planning an Arctic Observing Network, long-term monitoring, continuity of observations, better understand AON. Yeah, a lot of these things are gonna be included in our presentation coming up. System-wide coordination of observations, definitely. Haley, can you scroll down on seeing what's, yeah, next steps, overview of findings, filling gaps. Yeah, what people are needing and wanting and seeking, extreme events, citizen science projects, future trend monitoring, way forward for AON. Will NSF accept monitoring as critical? Yeah, lots of good entries here. Someone feeling very strongly about research into actions to produce informed decisions. Awesome. All right, let's go to the third one. Possibly.
All right, having some technical difficulties. Go to the third. There we go.
All right, this one is quick. Just add your poll answer. Have you read the report yet? Yes, no, maybe you skimmed it, or maybe you have it open in a tab, and you know that counts for something, and we want to give you credit for that. All right, seeing quite a few people who have read it, quite a few who haven't, some folks who've skimmed it. And one person who has it open in a tab, good for you. Skimmed it, cool. This helps us gauge how familiar you all are, so that we're not going too into the weeds if you haven't read it yet, but also aren't skimming the surface if you have. So great, this gives us that benchmark information. And with that, I'm going to hand it back, I believe, to Thorsten, or maybe Shoko, to pick up from here. Shoko, I think.
Yep, that's me. Well, thanks for your participation in that. It's good to see some of you have read it, and this presentation will give you a good overview on what you've missed, and then we can start a discussion. But before we go very far, I really wanted to make sure that we're all on the same page when we talk about Arctic Observing Networks. And I realized I just forgot to introduce myself. I did it in the chat, but I'm Shoko Shinbrat. I'm a AAAS Science and Technology Policy Fellow in the Office of Polar Programs at the National Science Foundation. So I likely needn't tell you, but there's more than one definition of the Arctic. This map shows the one defined under the Arctic Research Policy Act, which defines the Arctic as anything above a specific latitude line, except for obvious areas near the Bering Strait and inclusion of the Aleutian Islands, and in central Alaska, where the boundary is north of certain rivers. And it's this definition that we specifically consider in the report. And just a reminder in this slide, the Arctic is not a desolate space. It really supports the whole wide range of fish and wildlife, as well as several million people who live in cities and in rural areas. So next slide. Okay, so when you hear observing, I'm sure there are a range of different things that come to mind, but we use observations or observing systems to refer to the way in which we see things and measure change. And these can come from a range of sources, such as remote observations like satellites, or field truth through ships, buoys, weather stations, and including community-based monitoring, which can be of sea ice or marine mammals and a range of other things. Next slide. So finally, what is the networks in Arctic Observing Networks? So we consider networks for observations as those that lead in standardizing, in coordinating, and enhancing observing networks to increase the accessibility and to improve the ability to detect and understand changes. So There's an example that I provided here that are some of the networks funded by the National Science Foundation, which is through the Arctic Research Mapping application. But there are many other networks that are funded by other agencies that are not the National Science Foundation. And so nationally, that coordination is through USAON, not through NSF. And that guidance for USAON is provided through its USAON board, which is an interagency board of US federal agencies. Next slide. So what is the challenge? The challenge that many Arctic observing networks hope to tackle is kind of the scale at which the globe and the Arctic specifically are warming. And for reference, for those that don't know, the Arctic is warming up to 3-4 times faster than the rest of the planet. You can see in this image here, the red at the top of the globe. And this warming has real consequences, obviously, for the whole planet, with implications for security in the US, for livelihoods, ecosystems, and biodiversity. But Arctic Indigenous peoples are really at the front lines of these changes. And then the other challenge, and then the other challenge for observing is really the sparseness of which the Arctic is observed. To understand where we're going, we really need to understand where we currently are. So you can see here, this is an illustrative map of stream gauges and the immense kind of disparity in the density of stream gauges in the lower 48 versus in Alaska, where a single stream gauge is assumed to represent, something like 6,000 square miles. So that's about the size of Hawaii. So this dearth of infrastructure and information really hampers regional planning, forecasting, and in the case of stream gauges, warnings about floods and droughts. So this is just to illustrate a pervasive issue across all aspects of Arctic observing networks. Next slide. So David Allen already kind of introduced the impetus for this report, but so we received a call from the House of Representatives, the Appropriations Subcommittee, on this need to establish and maintain a sustained Arctic observing network, which should include recommendations on the implementation and construction of a network. So USAN began working on the report on behalf of IARPC for the Office of Science and Technology Policy. Next slide. So who was involved? It was written in collaboration with a number of different federal agencies, led by NSF, NOAA, NASA, and myself leading the coordination. And we had an amazing writing team of 23 members, and the IARPC member agencies reviewed and approved the document. And we hope that there will be continued involvement as we begin kind of moving towards implementation. So how did this all come together? I'll just do this briefly, but the report was really informed by 3 major sources. We did a literature synthesis of articles that were identified by the board as kind of seminal, really important articles on AON. We also did a survey to 19 representatives of federal agencies to identify what are the most important needs. And that'll be the results that Thorsten will present shortly. And then we reviewed non-federal input from the IARPC Arctic Research Plan and the Biennial Implementation Plan. And then the report also centers on several policy drivers that provide a common thread and motivation throughout the report. So it's informed primarily by the 4 pillars of the National Strategy for the Arctic Region, NSAR. They're on the slide here, but it's security, climate change and environmental protection, sustainable economic development, international cooperation, and governance. And then the 4 priority areas of IARPC's Arctic Research Plan. So for those of you who aren't familiar, those are community resilience and health, Arctic systems interactions, sustainable economies and livelihoods, and risk management and hazard mitigation. So with all that buildup, let me pass it off to Thorsten to go through our recommendations on Aeon needs.
Yeah, thank you so much, Shoko. So the report concludes with this context in mind. The report concludes with 4 recommendations. First, the support of critical observations and infrastructure. We need an infrastructure and observing system that is well coordinated and interconnected, and maybe most importantly, sustainably funded. Many of our observations depend on this typical NSF, NASA 3-year funding cycle, which is not really sufficient for an Arctic observing network. So our first recommendation is to support critical observations infrastructure long-term, so that we can depend on it for decision making. The second recommendation is improve data management systems. We, the data providing agencies, NASA, NSF, NOAA, but also USGS, etc., and other agencies, we all collect lots and lots of data. But it's hard for the users and the public, for the decision makers, to know who collected what data in what area. So I think there's a need to improve a data management system to make all this data available to the public, to researchers, decision makers, as I said, and take advantage of the full breadth of the observations that we are taking. The third recommendation is prioritize human and technological capacity building. We need to build research capacity for Arctic communities to conduct and share observations that support local decision making. And we also need to support technological solutions that can help fill the gaps and reduce the costs associated with observing remote areas in this harsh Arctic environment. And then finally, we need to close observational gaps that support decision making. And that's something that's very important, where we need to ensure that we have the right types of measurements, at the right scales, that we can make informed decisions with a focus, for the Arctic on climate resilience, national security, etc. And that includes atmospheric, cryospheric, marine, social, and also terrestrial observations. If we go to the next slide. Sorry, my screen is lost. So the next step is we want to work on an implementation strategy, and we want this strategy and this plan to be, inclusive. We want to engage and, the federal and non-federal partners who support and benefit from USAeon. And that includes a synthesis of existing activities, a policy-driven gaps assessment, a set of requirements for observing and data systems derived from that assessment, and an outline of agency responsibilities for coordination, governance, logistical support, and management. And that's what we want to start with this discussion later on. If we go to the next slide. And it's very important that the process includes equitable engagement. We want to take advantage, if you will, of indigenous communities and involve indigenous communities and indigenous knowledge in the design and the implementation of this plan. If you go to the next slide. And finally, we want to take advantage of the lessons learned from the recent development of the IARPC biennial implementation plan, because it can be quite complicated, it can be quite a beast, it can be a lot of work. So, and on this slide are a couple of lessons learned from the development of the IARPC biennial implementation plan. It's the clarity and communication around the expected process and any changes is key. Respecting subsistence seasons, critical. That is critical. We need sufficient staff and agency support, and that's a key factor. Drafting these documents, especially if there's a public input phase, takes a significant amount of time. Even 12 to 20 months can feel rushed. And finally, allowing for input on the scope and process rather than content only can improve buy-in and efficiency of the final product. And I think that's all I had. So if we go to the next slide, Hazel or Liz, and then hand it over to Sandy.
Okay, thanks so much for that overview, everyone. Good comments in the chat so far, very engaged group, which is really nice to see. So now this is the time when we really hope that you have a lot to say and a lot to share with us, because as was mentioned earlier in the process, the very quick writing deadline provided by Congress on this initial report did not afford us the time to do what we're doing here today. And so in our questions, you can see that because of that, we want to hear from you about both the work that we've already done on the report so far, but also in a more forward-looking approach. So Thorsten outlined some considerations for implementation and engagement, and these questions really just draw on that. If we move forward, what should we consider? How would you like to be engaged? Are there other people we should be speaking with? And if so, could you share that with us? And what other questions should we be asking? And as I mentioned, while it's not explicitly on here, for those of you who did read the report, we'd be very curious to hear what you think we got right or got wrong. So with that, I'll just open the floor for questions. And I think maybe what we could do is just give people a moment to read the questions and then go into gallery view so we can turn on our cameras and see each other a little bit better. But please raise your hand or put comments in the chat if you'd like to speak. Yes, I see Jack Dibb has his hand up. Jack, please go ahead.
Yeah, I don't know who this is addressed to, probably any of you that were part of this report writing. I appreciate the need, that the plan to be more inclusive and, more responsive to the needs of specific regions and communities. But I was just curious, I have the impression that USAON and Sustainable Arctic Observing Network have been working on these questions for quite a long time, and that there are some versions of plans already. So is none of that useful to you? Is that not a foundation to build from?
Thanks, Jack. Great question. Maybe I'll put this back to either Shoko or Thorsten, because I think they spoke to some of the things that were brought into the report writing process. Thorsten, do you want to take that, or Shoko?
Yeah, I can talk a little bit about it. Completely agree. That's what USAON is, all about in some ways, and we have a great foundation to build on. But as we move forward with the potential implementation, we want to make sure, extra sure, if you will, that we are very inclusive in the development of this plan. And AON does that to some extent. We have, monthly board meetings, as you know, but it's important that we do this, very consciously and deliberately, and we want to make sure we do it the right way to be inclusive. And this is why we're having this discussion. We want to hear from you, how can we do better? How can we work on an implementation that is truly inclusive and addresses the needs of the various communities, and not
No,
so much just
I-
agency driven.
No, I appreciate that. I guess the thought that it's going to take 2 years maybe to develop a plan is a little scary. Just the urgency of actually continuing or sustaining or adding new critical observations. And if the planning is going to take that long, it's a little bit frightening. I guess that's the reason I asked the question. But thanks for your answer.
No, it's a good one. I mean, and maybe Larry should talk a little bit about it, because, this request for the report came from Congress. And, there may be, a request, follow-up request coming to be more specific what the needs are. And that can result in a, funded or unfunded mandate, for the various agencies. So the process is, not as quickly as we, obviously we hope, because, Congress is involved in the whole process. And then maybe, Larry, you put your camera on, maybe you want to elaborate on this a little bit. Sorry.
Just a bit in that. So we really viewed this report. So we all, I think everybody on this call understands the importance of having more observations and more longer time series and more comprehensive components of the whole system, so that we can see how a change in one component of the system affects the other components of the systems. And you are correct. You're right on that. We've been trying to expand the existing observations for well over a decade. We've worked at that through various agencies that do have a responsibility for observations, but we've also worked at that through individual grants from funding agencies and research programs that can't support long-term observations, but can provide a more comprehensive view of the whole. But we still don't feel like we've gotten to the existence and the maintenance of a long-term system, so long-term observing network. And so this report is just intended to help us move that in that direction. And there's it obviously it takes time. We're getting there. We're improving it every year, but it takes time. I think that this report is the U.S. response or contributions or complement to the International SAON program, in that every nation engaged in Arctic research has an understanding of their own priorities, their own justification for doing Arctic research, as the U.S. does. And so hopefully we can get the U.S. government to provide the support needed to establish and maintain this network. And this report, I think, is a good step in that direction. And I'll stop there. I hope I addressed your concerns. Thanks.
Thanks, everyone. Good discussion there. And I see Gary Mendeville has entered something into the chat. Gary, if you want to come off mute and read your comment, otherwise I can read it on your behalf.
No, I'm just trying to focus on that it needs to, the whole observing networks also needs to be confirmed by boots on the ground. What brought that to mind is a recent study that was being done, and I'm not sure which agency, whether it was NOAA or NASA, but it was looking at snow cover on the Anwar coastal plain, and all the researchers and data scientists were based at a university, I think mostly in Virginia and other places. And that just got me to question, are they, because of their lack of experience in Alaska and in the Arctic, are they going to be making assumptions and sort of taking that data into areas where it doesn't really belong, because they don't have that boots on the ground knowledge? And so that was my concern, that it's a big workload to make sure that there's a lot of boots on the ground confirmation of what's going on. But I think it's important if you're going to get buy-in from the local residents and from the decision makers.
Thanks, Gary. That was a great example, and to ground your comment. And I don't know if anybody wants to respond to that directly or add their own perspective on this particular issue, and how we can, in particular, what would be great to hear is how in our next phase of work with engagement and moving towards thinking about implementation, we can act on that kind of idea in a more effective way. Yes, Rami, I see you have your hand up.
Thank you, everyone. I may grunt or use hand signals or something. I deal with a relatively heavy neural load. On that point, the phenomena that we are paying attention to is changing at a speed and a pace that some of the infrastructures of our agencies and our economies and our educational systems, like those aren't going to be able to necessarily shift nearly as fast as what the actual phenomena of the studies. So with remote sensing and boots on the ground, and as we're doing convergence and interdisciplinary co-production of knowledge work, in a sense, in order to go faster, we have to go slower and give ourselves a break to realize that we are trying to pull off something kind of impossible. And there is a solution. It just may not be immediately using the same tools and tech that we have come to. So I wanted to comment in order to just take a minute to say, indeed, we are doing important work, good work. We're not failing at it. We may not know what the resolution is yet. And I mean pixel data resolution, as well as the experience and how we survive at resolution. Those two things aren't as separate, and they need to be related with separately. So I am very encouraged that you all are continuing to pay attention to the data, but also not to separate yourself from it. And the remote sensing and the field work is part of it, but we're also affording all this co-production of knowledge and reconciliation. And so some of this is a part of that conversation as well. So we're not going too slow, we're not going too fast. The authenticity of our reconciliation of the data does matter. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Rami. Those were really spot on comments for this thread of the discussion. Very supportive and helpful. I see there's a little bit more dialogue in the chat. I think in particular, this human capacity aspect, especially people living in the region, people with community perspective, Indigenous knowledge perspective. It seems like there's a lot of a convergence around those points. And as we are noting, there's not always ground under our work. Sometimes we're on the water and doing that work on boats as well. Other thoughts on this point or other questions on the list? Does anybody want to just raise their hand and say, hey, please come to my meeting, and Hazel can get you on the list for engagement? And Shoko, I'd welcome you to come off mute if you want to make that comment directly.
Sure. So just responding to Jack's comment about like this needs to happen sooner rather than later, and aren't we already doing things? And I just wanted to underline that if you look at the report, it's structured with recommendations of where we need to go, but also where are we now and what framework can we use to move forward. And those sections are really very vibrant. They have a lot of different examples and places that we can build on and work towards. And I'm sure other people can put things in the chat of examples that we might be missing. But yeah, so just wanted to say we're not starting from scratch.
Great, thanks for that. Yeah, I go back to your point in the slides about how many documents were synthesized, which really I think draws from what Jack was saying. There was a lot of information out there, And I think maybe why Congress called on us for this report was because they wanted to maybe see it better synthesized and in one place with some more broad conclusions. And David Allen has his hand in the air.
Yeah, I appreciate all of the discussion around the table, and I guess I wanted to sort of build on some of the points that Shoko and others have made, that we're not standing still, and I appreciate the urgency of Arctic change and why we feel the urgency, but I think we also have to recognize, like I believe Rami pointed out, that and actually Sandy as well, that the way the network was developed was to answer questions that were primarily set to answer global questions, or the network that we have as it currently stands was designed to answer global questions, or questions that may be more responsive to concerns of the lower 48. And what we want to do by a careful assessment and identification of a way forward with partners in the region and rural communities, as well as cities, and but Arctic residents writ large, is to design a network that is actually inclusive of the interests and the needs of Arctic residents, and answers questions on timescale that are more appropriate and more relevant to folks who are actually needing to make decisions on a day-to-day basis, and are trying to figure out how to survive all of the change that is currently taking place. So it is really I wanted to sort of respond in one way, that we're not standing still, and that we are still making a great deal of observations, but at the same time, in thinking about the way forward, we want to figure out a more inclusive and in so doing, more complete Arctic observing network that includes the concerns of everyone, including particularly Arctic residents who have typically been left out of a lot of the discussion. That's all. Thank you.
Great, Rami.
I just wanted to add to that, when we're speaking of real world communities, the last frontier has been something that a lot of individuals have taken advantage of, have made their lives of in different ways. And so there's an understanding, you may understand the difference between some of the political conversations, that there's a misunderstanding or a gap of understanding, where some of these conversations we are having like this may be misunderstood because of all the years of what the Arctic has been. And so there's more of a gap also, or opportunity in this network and this conversation moving forward, to not forget, you know, a lot of the people who have just done the general work on the ground, who may have a different political understanding, or with the data or the large scale, or have a different relationship with Russians or Chinese, or, you know, whatever their understanding of those things are. We have the opportunity, because things are what they are, with the scale of what they are, to do it, as you just said, sir, you know, that we're not standing still, and that the political differences are legitimate, but because of this work, these conversations, we have a chance to deflate, to diffuse, and actually pay attention to the data, in a sense, respecting the experiences of the people on the ground. Because if we just keep coming with this heavy top down, here's what you need to do for climate, here's what you need to do for electrification, here's what you need to do, we're not giving people the sense to orient themselves with the data and with the experiences. So I think this is a tremendous conversation that you're having, and that we're having. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much for your comment. I do want to draw people's attention to something in the report that I think speaks to this, and something we'd love to hear more on. There's a box in the report where we talk about the types of programs that seem like very good practices for empowering things from the grassroots. One example of that is the EPA GAPS program, IGAP program. where money goes directly to tribes to lead on their own, under their own direction on initiatives. And we felt that this could suggest a really powerful path forward for developing the AON programs like this. And given the tack that this direction or this discussion is taking, maybe that would be a nice thing to hear more from you all about, if you feel like these programs, this program or others that you're aware of, are effective, or what we can do to generate more leadership and or support more leadership from the grassroots. Gary.
Yeah, I put something in the chat just about the importance of considering lessons learned from different researchers in the field. At least from my experience, academia and in industry, people are not really always willing to share their failures. And I think we need to learn from those failures and pass that information on to other people. Otherwise, they'll just keep getting repeated over and over again, because the technology that's out there that may be designed for one environment may not be actually functional in another environment. We dealt with some anemometers that were supposed to be state of the art, and they lasted less than 10 minutes in a particular situation because of rime ice. And we found out that the rime ice on the western coast, especially in Alaska, is much different than that on the East Coast, which is where all this equipment had been designed.
Great. Thank you, Gary. Very, very astute comment again about really having that local knowledge, that local expertise. I think Brian Melzian, our EPA board member for USAN, was trying to raise his hand, but Brian, are you able to just come off mute, and were you trying to make a comment?
Yes, can you hear me?
I can, yes.
Okay, thank you. Great presentation, everyone, great job. I'm part of the board representing the EPA that helped to produce this report. And just to address a couple issues for your information, regarding the current state of the U.S. Arctic Observing Network, that starts on page 13. And you don't need to look at it now, but there's much important seminal information about Indigenous and community-led observations, vessel-based observations, autonomous platforms, field stations, etc., that was developed from all the references that Sandy was referring to. So we took a lot of effort before we put pen to paper, looking what has been done and how it could be useful for an Arctic Observing Network. Then lastly, it's at the end of the report. It may not seem like it, but those boxes that we're referring to took a tremendous amount of time and work to consolidate information, such as Table C, research, organization, and uptake challenges to Arctic observing networks. Another one, current examples of Arctic surface observing assets by domain and theme. If you folks are interested in this topic, which I think you are, maybe you could peruse those sections and tables to let us know if we missed something or we misstated something. But that was a major effort to consolidate much information. Just look at the references into a like, here's where we are now, based on all the work IARPC and others have done over time. And then most importantly, how do we proceed to an implementation plan? Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. Yeah, you were instrumental in helping us pull some of those tables together, and they are quite useful. So I hope people do take a look at those, give us feedback. Other questions? Anyone we haven't heard from yet that has been saving their question for the tantalizing last 5 minutes of discussion. Jack.
Yeah, I just have a comment, and I know that there's a lot of good stuff going on all around, but the thing that's, a few years ago, someone wrote a paper about how the research on the Arctic that was place-based is is overwhelmingly from about 6 or 7 places because there's infrastructure there, right? And you could probably guess where many of the places are, right? Like Tule, Utiavik, maybe Summit, Alert, and some other stations, Niallison. But people go there because it's possible. And I guess that's a real question for all of us is, can you build that kind of infrastructure in more places, and where are the critical places? Or do we really need to double down on more autonomous stuff that can go to places where there's not established infrastructure that makes it easy for people to live there or go there?
Yeah, great comment, Jack. Thank you.
I'm sorry, the cat attacked me.
It wasn't an alpaca attack. Brian, was your hand up from before, or did you have another comment? Okay, maybe that was an historic hand. I might draw your attention to the additional comments in the chat about engagement is something we particularly wanted to hear. Arlo speaking to the streetlight effect, where you're looking for your keys when you drop them. It's a really powerful concept, and maybe in the comment section, Jack, I think I know which paper you're talking about, but if you want to drop a link to it in the comment section, it was an excellent summary.
I'm not sure I can find it right away, but I'll see if I can find it afterwards and send it to you, Sandy, or to Hazel.
I think I have my hands on it somewhere as well. I might, not seeing a lot of hands flying in the air, I might just kind of make a comment to connect some dots, because Jack, earlier you had mentioned sustaining Arctic observing networks, SAON, our international counterpart to US AON. And for those who are familiar with the roadmap for Arctic observing and data systems, the SAON roads process, that's the recommended planning process and planning toolkits that are being developed amongst SAON's international partnerships, partnerships with permanent participants and other global organizations, and our own kind of high-level outline for how we would move forward with implementation is really an echo of the roads process. And so I just wanted to bring that to people's attention, just to say we're not proposing to do something different from the SAON roads process, that we recognize, and in the report we recognize the value of it as a process and a path forward. So it would also be useful to hear from any of you on that point as well, if you're familiar with the process, or if there's other kind of planning tools or processes that we should be paying attention to.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that we did not like that. It looks like Liz found the citation to the paper I was thinking of, and it put it in the chat.
Great.
Oh, thanks, Liz.
Yeah, fast work.
Gets me off the hook.
Me too. Okay, well, so we do have a few minutes left for we probably have time for one final comment, and then Hazel, or was it David that was going to talk about next steps? Oh, I was going to talk about next steps. As I'm looking,
I'm happy to as well, whatever is.
Well, since Hazel has agreed to be the point of contact for this, maybe Hazel, I'll let you talk about what we'd like to hear next.
Sure. Yeah, we just have a couple of points here of ways to stay connected in this process. I guess I'll introduce myself first. My name is Hazel Shapiro. I'm the US AON program analyst. And I put my email in the chat earlier. Maybe someone could add it again, so folks have that. If you'd like to reach out, if you think of something, while you're eating lunch or dinner later, happy to hear those, and you can send comments or questions or a request to have this presentation or something similar. If you have a group that might be interested, happy to bring that over to other venues as well. We are hoping to host a town hall at AGU. So if you'll be there, you can join us there as well. And then if you'd like to just sort of stay up to date with how this is developing and how the process is moving forward, you can join the IARPC observations or MOMP teams, and we will be sure to keep both of those groups updated. And perhaps Liz or Meredith, you could drop a link to join those groups in the chat as well. Yeah, and again, feel free to contact me if you have any more questions or would like us to join one of your meetings. This recording will be posted on the IARPC website and on YouTube. So if you have colleagues that weren't able to make it today, you'll be able to find it there, and the slides are available there as well if you'd like to look back through them. And I will pass it back to Sandy or one of the co-chairs to wrap us up.
Okay. Well, thanks so much, everyone, for your participation. It was really nice to see so many new and familiar faces join in for this discussion. I think you know how to reach us all. Now we would welcome an opportunity to come your way and have dialogue of your choosing about this topic. And so thanks again, and we look forward to hearing from you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you all. Blessings.